So I welcome once again Colonel Douglas Macgregor, CEO of Our Country, Our Choice. Uh, and I thought we would start by talking a little bit about what's happened since we last spoke. Sweden is now a member of NATO. So my question is, will we now see Turkey, Albania, and the US come to our rescue?
Well, I wouldn't hold my breath while I waited for all of that to happen. But I think it is rather strange that after all these years of peace and prosperity, at a point in time when Washington seems to be determined to provoke Moscow into some sort of confrontation for which the United States is absolutely not prepared, Sweden would choose to join the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It is odd in the extreme to me, since I don't regard Russia as presenting an existential threat to anyone in Europe or the United States. Now, I suppose, much like any human being, if you attack them enough and push them far enough, they can strike back. But I just don't see any evidence for the Russians having any interest whatsoever in a collision with the West. None. So I think it's strange that the Swedes, at this particular point in time in history, would want to join with an alliance led by governments in Washington, London, Paris, and Berlin that are, if anything, completely out of touch with reality, on a suicide path in every sense of the word, and in the midst of this want to wage war against the Russians. I think it's beyond astonishing.
You know, when we grew up and we went to school, we were always taught that Sweden is not allied with anyone and we are neutral in war. And this was the greatest thing ever, we were taught. We were so fortunate to have this situation. And then just overnight, all parties were on board with joining NATO. And there was no debate. There was not even close to a referendum. And suddenly, no, we're on board. So everything we've been taught since childhood was apparently wrong. It wasn't that great.
Well, the thing that's interesting is that at the end of the Second World War, one could have made a case for joining NATO on the grounds that an alliance with the United States and other West European states would bring security to Sweden in some form. Today, Sweden is essentially importing insecurity. Remember that the United States no longer enjoys this position of what I would call military hegemony. In other words, unchallenged, unmatched military supremacy over anyone. And we see enormous quantities of evidence that the Russians are as far along in all the key areas of military capability as we are. So we're not dealing with a backward country. We're not dealing with a country exhausted by the Second World War. We're dealing with a very vibrant society with a very cohesive people who believe strongly in their country and in its cause. And I think President Putin has demonstrated repeatedly extraordinary self-control, a dispassionate approach to problem solving, even as recently as a few days ago when he had to come on television and talk about this terrible atrocity in Moscow. He absolutely refused under any circumstances to pin the blame on anything. In fact, he said, we need a thorough investigation. There are too many possibilities. We have to narrow them. And once we've completed our investigation, then we will discuss who the responsible party is. In other words, he could have taken this as an opportunity to fan heightened fear, anger, and hatred in Russia. He did the opposite. Yet we hear an awful lot of rhetoric coming out of Washington, Paris, and London that is full of hatred, uh, emotion, and I would say imprudent statements about Moscow and Russia. It's an interesting development.
Do you have any ideas of who might be behind the the attack?
I think that we're going to discover several things. In fact, we are already quite aware that this had nothing to do with any jihadists. contrary to what was said publicly. And normally when the United States and its obedient media almost immediately announce the perpetrator, the New York Times listed it on the front page. This was ISIS-K, which is pure unadulterated nonsense. But the fact that they responded so quickly indicates that the intelligence communities had given them direction to announce this. And we chimed in as a government immediately. Hopefully, I guess, that we would pin the blame on someone other than Ukraine and ourselves. But I think what we're discovering is these were not jihadists. Jihadists don't surrender. Jihadists usually fight to the bitter end or effectively committing suicide. Secondly, this was very amateurish. These people seem to have been mercenary thugs who were promised a lot of money. I don't know if they were all Tajiks, but certainly we have evidence for at least one of them that was in the region and actually, I'm talking about in Russia, and had actually visited the location of the terrorist attack on the 7th of March. I don't know about the rest of them, but my suspicion is that we'll discover that, yes, they entered Russia from Ukraine. And when they completed their atrocity, they headed back to Ukraine, stupidly along the same route, using the same automobile. I mean, we're talking about exceptionally low IQ here. The interesting part is there was a weapons cache inside of Russia to which they were directed. That smacks very much of MI6 in London or the CIA in Langley. So I think it will come out that this was orchestrated by Ukrainians. And remember, today, the Zelensky regime is a dying regime. Zelensky's regime is a fatally wounded animal that will strike out with whatever it has in a last desperate bid to prove that it's still alive and capable. So tactical ballistic missiles, drones, cruise missiles, anything that requires very little manpower and has any chance of harming Russians inside of Russia is the preferred instrument that they're going to utilize. And that's exactly what they did here. I'm confident.
Yeah. Terrorism is cheap, easy. So any ideas of how long Ukraine will last? Is it possible to say?
I think that's really in President Putin's hands now. He's been very slow to move forward. He's consolidated all of his gains. He's tried desperately to find a negotiating party in Washington or a negotiating partner somewhere in Europe. Everyone has stonewalled him. He doesn't want to take heavy casualties himself, and he's done everything he could to prevent that. And he has reluctantly killed large numbers of Ukrainian soldiers. And I say reluctant because from the very beginning, he pointed out these are Orthodox Slavs, much like ourselves. I think he probably still feels that way, but I think he probably now also recognizes there will be no negotiated end to this with the West. That means that once the ground firms up mid to late April, and you can move large ground forces towards the river, he will do so. I expect that he'll cross the river this summer and take Odessa. He'll certainly take Kharkov, probably at the same time or even first. He may well decide to close the gap between his forces and Kiev, right up to the river's edge. And then he has to make a decision. Do I sit here and wait for the United States and its allies to turn Ukraine into some sort of Afghan guerrilla project designed to continue to destroy Ukraine and harm Russians? Or do I cross the river and end it on my terms? I don't know which he will do, but he will certainly do what I said before as a minimum.
Has the US seems to have stopped funding the Ukraine now and left it up to the Europeans? Would that make a big difference?
We did send a package of something like $300 million recently. Of course, that's a drop in the bucket. Yes, you're right. The Europeans are being encouraged to fill the void. And I certainly can't imagine why anybody would want to send any money to Ukraine at this point. First of all, it's not effectively employed. Secondly, they depend heavily on NATO officers and soldiers inside the country to operate all the sophisticated equipment. That includes the command centers, the advisory staffs, and complex weapon systems. And otherwise, I think the money is stolen. We have large numbers of people inside the Ukrainian army who've been reporting far more soldiers as being alive than dead. And that's so the officers in the chain of command could pocket their salaries. It also prevents widows and orphans from receiving any cash for their departed husbands and fathers. So I can't imagine why anybody would send a dime there. But yes, I think you're right. These are globalists. And I keep trying to come up with a really good definition for globalist. The only thing that I can come up with is that they're very ideologically, they seem to have a lot in common with the sort of Trotskyite Bolsheviks. They absolutely refuse to see reality. They see the world through a very different lens. Human beings are soulless animals, essentially sheep-like consumers who should be herded in the right direction for their own benefit. Denationalization, destruction of national identity, the ruin of national culture, fostered and cultivated by the influx of millions of non-Europeans, seems to be the top item on the agenda. And against this backdrop of silliness and insanity that is destroying Europe, and we haven't even touched on the climate warfare insanity that has deindustrialized Germany and much of the rest of Europe, they want to challenge Russia militarily. The Russians today are stronger militarily than they have been since the 1980s. And one wonders why now. If you look at the weakness that characterizes everything about Europe and the United States at this point, why would you want to do that? But that seems to be their belief. They seem to think that none of the things that do matter, that constitute the foundations for real military power, are important. In other words, the quality of the manpower, the training, the human capital, the commitment to national defense, commitment to formations that are composed of people who love their country. All of these things have been brushed by the wayside in favor of challenging, this Russian national state that, as I said, is now stronger, more robust in every sense of the word, economically, politically, socially, culturally, than it's been in decades.
I saw a report today about Swedish youth. 1/3 do not qualify for military service of any kind. That can also be maybe explained partly by we really don't have much of a sense of nation, and the willingness to fight for abstract ideas like democracy and ideologies may not be so tempting. So they start out with an online form describing their general health and personality, and from that, about 1/3 are disqualified immediately. And I can see that the will to fight isn't really that great. When I did my military service, we did it with a sense of pride.
Mm-hmm.
I was handed my gun and basically explained that, take care of this. This is your life insurance, and use it to defend our freedom and way of life. But you wouldn't hear anything like that today. So I think the will to sacrifice for something like that isn't really that great.
Well, it's astonishing to me because when the representative of the Swedish crown visited Marshal Bernadotte, who at the time was a Marshal of France under Napoleon Bonaparte, and announced to him that he was being offered the Swedish crown, one of the questions that arose almost immediately is, why would you want a Frenchman, a Marshal of Napoleon, to accept the crown of Sweden? I've never been there. I don't know anything about it, and so forth. And the answer was, we are an ancient kingdom, an ancient people. We want to survive. We need good leadership. And you are a Marshal of France, and you are not servile to Napoleon. Well, it sounds like the Swedes have decided they're no longer an ancient kingdom, an ancient nation, and they don't particularly care whether or not they survive. I don't know how else to interpret it. And that's tragic because this sort of
And
disease is what brings down civilizations.
you know, one way of interpreting that is also that Swedes are very fascinated with whoever is the world power at the time. And that was France at the time. And today it is the US, or at least the end of US power. But we're always a little bit behind. So we're jumping on the NATO ship as it's sinking. And and what is actually more sinister than NATO is we have a defense cooperation agreement with the US. It's about to be voted on in Parliament in April. And it's our Minister of Defense, who is well trained by the US and is a true globalist. He basically designed this agreement. The rest of the government doesn't really know the details of it. And the people in Parliament, they know even less what it really means. I mean, there's a document, you can read it. But so there's actually been a lawsuit filed against him. We'll see. That probably will go nowhere. But this agreement, Norway has something similar, and they have a clause in there which prohibits nuclear arms. We have nothing like that. So we have basically given away our territory, opened up 17 bases for the use of the United States at their own discretion. Personnel doesn't have to obey Swedish law. They don't need to tell us what they bring in to these bases, what kind of arms. And when he was questioned about why don't we have any restrictions, well, they know what we mean and our intentions, and our position is clear. Do you think there will be any risk of nuclear weapons on Swedish soil?
The first thing that springs to mind is that the last nation that signed such an open-ended agreement was Germany in the aftermath of World War II. And of course, in the 1950s, when West Germany, the rump of the German state, joined NATO, there was a reason for that. They had been defeated in the Second World War. They didn't have much choice in the matter. Sweden is not a defeated nation. It doesn't have to behave like one. But what you've done now, I think, is made yourselves hostage to U.S. interests, policies, and behavior. And that is something I would not do. I would recommend that anyone avoid that to the extent that they can. It's not just nuclear. What do you do if the United States, with the current government that is populated by some of the most dangerous people I think I've seen in my lifetime, ideologically unbalanced and disconnected from strategic reality, let alone their own country? Why would you want to be hostage to that situation? How do you know that a conflagration involving China and Russia, Iran, any number of different states will not suddenly have an impact on Sweden? You find that you are within range of weapons that you thought would never be used against you, simply because you've embedded yourselves with American military power and U.S. troops. So I think it's a very serious mistake, and I think the Parliament should insist on reviewing it and ultimately approving it before anyone recognizes it as effective. So I don't know what you can do, but I would definitely do that. The nuclear clause, of course, as you point out, is very important. And I've worried a great deal. I have friends in Finland, and I worry that the Finns are putting themselves in an equally dangerous position because they, like you, the Finns are close to the Arctic Circle. And those are geostrategic positions from which to threaten Russia and very vital interests in Russia, not the least of which involves its ports, its naval power, but also its nuclear deterrent. And as missiles become more and more hypersonic and more hyper accurate, those stand an excellent chance of showing up in northern Sweden and northern Finland for potential use against the Russians. And if that's the case, then the Russians will have to regard those areas as target rich. In other words, places that they will have to strike and strike early and decisively to avoid losing their own capabilities. This is the thing that I don't think people understand. You know, today, having forces forward, which is what we've historically done, is to put them at risk of immediate annihilation. This is not 1945, it's not 1950, 1960, or 1970. Technology has raced ahead. It's very difficult to disentangle yourselves from this kind of binding agreement, given the technology that's available. You know, one of the things that I advocate for the United States, I've advocated it for a long time, is the notion of limited liability partnerships. I think this business of alliances that are supposed to trigger conflict and crisis automatically are undesirable and legacies of a past from which we do not seem to have learned anything. I mean, that's 1914 in spades. And then again, we see the stupidity emerge in 1939 and 40. So I talk about limited liability partnerships, that we should be prepared to cooperate with anyone for limited purposes, provided the interests overlap and we have some commonality of interest. But the notion of making as many people as possible permanent partners and potentially subjugating them to Washington's whims politically, I think is very dangerous, and it's the last thing we should pursue. But of course, I hold the minority opinion.
Yeah, I know what it feels like. Another interesting thing is Swedes, of course, hate Trump. They've been taught by the media. So there's a chance that we will be subject to President Donald Trump's military with these agreements, which is kind of an irony.
I don't know. First of all, I don't know what President Trump would do when he's elected, because frankly, he's like every other American, very focused on what's happening here. I mean, the problems that we confront here at home are enormous. Every 100 days, we add another $1 trillion to our national sovereign debt. And we have a problem right now. Our dollar is very strong, but the consumer is weak. And for the global financial system to work well, the dollar needs to be weak and the consumer needs to be strong. And then you have the other problem, that there's a growing lack of faith and confidence in this thing we call the great American economy. People are now investing not in long-term treasuries, they're investing in short-term treasuries. Normally, it's 80% of the investment goes into the long-term treasury bond. Right now, it's only 20%, and 80% is going into short-term treasuries. People want to be sure they can rapidly extract their money. Again, I mean, the Swedes are a very smart people. And I would think people in the Swedish government, the Finnish government, in fact, all the governments in Europe and around the world would look at these conditions I've just described, and it should give them pause. To this has to be added the fact that we can't recruit right now for the armed forces. That's not because we don't have people and men that are willing to fight, but the men, particularly the white men that have constituted the backbone of the armed forces for a very long time, have decided they don't want to serve in it anymore. And the armed forces are not in good shape. We're filling up with large numbers of women. And then in what has got to be the greatest insult ever hurled at the United States Army and Marines, these people on the Hill that call themselves globalists have said, well, fine, we'll just recruit illegal aliens who've recently crossed into the United States to fill the ranks of the Army and the Marines. Well, that all that does is convince men like me, forget it. Why would you want to be a part of this silly nonsense? And of course, this plays into the LGBTQR6, whatever it is, acronym, and the silly nonsense that women can do everything men can do, and there's no difference and so forth. This fits in with what I call modern Bolshevism or globalism. But it's sick, it's destructive. And why would you want to make yourselves dependent upon a power that is this confused? But then again, I guess you're telling me the Swedes are equally confused.
Yeah. Yeah, we have bought into the same ideologies. They permeate our society as well. Interesting how the Bolsheviks left Russia and moved into Washington, D.C. and London and Brussels and all these other countries.
That's right. And taken over our universities.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So yeah, you mentioned. So is that seriously a thing? Filling the ranks with illegal aliens?
Well, I certainly do not, but people on the Hill talked about it openly. They all happen to be what I would call left-wing Bolsheviks or left-wing globalists, senators and congressmen, but they were quite serious about it. And of course, they know nothing about military power. I think this is another matter that escapes attention. We haven't seen a real war for a very long time. When I say a real war, I'm talking about a war on the scale of the Korean War, which was probably the last war that America fought in, where it was very nearly driven into the sea. I mean, we were almost defeated and destroyed on the Korean Peninsula. We were rescued by General MacArthur. But the point is that we haven't seen anything like that since. Now, Vietnam cost us 58,000 dead and over 150,000 wounded. But again, those casualties in the period of time over 10 years are really quite modest compared with the losses again during the Korean War that happened within the space of about 3 years. So you lose 38,000 dead in Korea within a space of 3 years. That's a significant loss. And in World War I, we lost 110,000 dead in only 110 days of fighting. I mean, these things are incomprehensible to people today. So they fling this word war around without understanding what it really means. Now, I've been to war and I've seen the consequences of it, and I've certainly seen a country devastated by it and the people that lived in that country horribly harmed by it. I don't want that to happen to my country, and I don't know why anyone would want to invite it to Sweden. And I would say that doing what the Swedes have done, given the circumstances that exist today with Russia and the unwillingness of people in Washington to behave in a civil manner, treat the Russians with respect and take their strategic interests seriously, means that there's a damn good chance that you could be drawn into something that you don't want anything to do with. It could be fatal to you.
Yeah, we have this idea that because we now have the US and the NATO backing us, we are pretty much invincible. We could go and take on the Russians, and yeah, we'll be the first line of defense. And yeah, but we haven't seen a war in 200 years, so I don't know where they get these ideas from.
Well, war has become something that people watch on television that happens on someone else's soil. So they have no personal affiliation with it or affinity for it. It's very sad. It's very tragic. I mean, it's a good thing that we've avoided these kinds of wars, but we've lost our sense of balance and reason when it comes to the topic. That's why we want to ship thousands of women into harm's way to be killed by the enemy or much worse. And don't look at the criticality of harsh discipline, demanding discipline, unit cohesion, effective leadership. These things are beyond people's imagination, and they're dismissed out of hand in Washington, D.C. by these globalists. Oh, that doesn't matter. You're living in the past. That doesn't make any difference anymore, really. I think we've just had a tutorial in Eastern Ukraine on just how much it does matter.
Yeah, I don't know. The Ukrainians, they didn't know that women fight just as well as men, since they only sent men. They could have made the difference.
Ukrainians have begun sending more and more women who are also dying in great numbers. Even, I'm told, some pregnant women, which is beyond the pale for me. I can't even imagine how they came upon that. But again, these are globalists. This is back to this sort of contemporary version of Trotskyite Bolshevism.
Yeah.
And I'm sure
what do you think of
I'm sure some of the people in your audience have read enough about the early Soviet Union to understand that what the initial Bolsheviks tried to implement was eventually thrown out because you couldn't maintain either a military or a society by embracing these silly notions. You know, they eliminated marriage for all intents and purposes. Marriage was just, oh, you sign a document, you send it into the central administration. You want to get divorced, well, you sign a document, send it into the administration. You're pregnant, don't want to be, you get abortion on demand. In other words, the family itself was destroyed. And these silly notions were implemented, and you got chaos. And by 1922, it became very clear to Lenin that the whole country was going to fall apart. And so these things were then rolled back consistently.
Yeah. What would you say is the future of NATO? Since we're now
I think NATO behind the scenes is crumbling. If anyone doesn't understand that, then they need to take a long and hard look. I'm sure there are delusional people in various ministries of defense across Europe, but for the most part, I think people understand that we have awakened the Russians to the ugly truth that they are unreasonably and irrationally hated and despised by the West. And the Russians know it, and the Russians are prepared to deal with it, and they will escalate as necessary to defend themselves. The Europeans do not have effective armed forces. They know that. I mean, something like the Royal Air Force is a flying circus today in Great Britain. They know that. You're not going to defend yourselves with submarines against the Russians. The Russians are a great continental power, much as the Germans were historically. You have to have the capability to deter them. You deter them by maintaining effective armed forces that make the likelihood of an easy victory impossible. Now, where does that exist in Europe? Virtually nowhere.
France.
Yeah. Well, I think Mr. Macron has already backed away and now told everyone that if he sends these French Foreign Legion in, they'll be in a non-combat role. Since I have a friend in the French Foreign Legion, he'll probably laugh himself to death because he can't conceive of the French Foreign Legion having any role other than killing the enemies of the French state. But these are the stupid comments coming out of Paris. And again, if they're dumb enough to cross into Moldova and cross from Moldova into Ukraine, they will be taken under fire. One of the things the Russians have done, certainly once again with the vast missile strikes that have been launched over the last few days against Kiev, missile strikes, incidentally, that destroyed more Patriot missile launchers and equipment, which we don't think works terribly well at this point anyway. But also the energy grid, the energy infrastructure, the transportation system, blackening whole cities because they have no energy to light them. These things are not being done accidentally. They are targeting right up to the Polish border, right near Lvov. And they're demonstrating that if you're dumb enough to cross that border in strength with regular combat forces, they will be taken under fire immediately and annihilated. This is the era of ISR strike. You have intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance platforms in space, overhead at every altitude, sensors at sea. All of these are then linked to a whole range or array of strike systems, rockets, missiles, artillery, you name it. This will then be employed effectively against you. And right now, there is nothing the Russians cannot strike effectively in Europe except for the southernmost tip of Portugal.
Okay.
Now, you tell me, where are the integrated air defenses in NATO? Oops, they don't exist. Where are the air defenses for the ground forces to prevent them from being annihilated by top attack from a whole range of systems, drones and so forth, and smart bombs and you name it? Well, they don't exist. They don't exist for us either. We are not prepared to do anything. And ultimately, Putin knows that. He's not interested in a war. He wants to get on with business. He wants to do business. And we've decided that he's unworthy because he's not a globalist. He's not a member of the liberal international order, which is whatever we say it is. That means that we approve of you and you're one of us. Well, that's not working very well. Most of the world doesn't want anything to do with it. Globalism is about as popular as the plague in most of the world. So I think we're deluding ourselves, but we need to stop it, and we need to stop it soon before we get tangled into something very bad.
Would you say that this conflict has laid bare the actual relative strengths of the West versus Russia, which we didn't know before?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think we
Putin
do.
probably thought the West was stronger, as probably did the West too.
Absolutely. I think that the Russians were surprised at how poorly some of the weapon systems that we provided performed. I think they're surprised at the weakness in the military establishments in Europe, and they're also not unaware of the problems that we confront at home with our own armed forces. So I think you're absolutely right. Again, it's time to climb down off the so-called high horse, stop deluding ourselves, and behave like normal human beings and do business and bring this war to an end. The Polish chief of staff said that he thought millions of Ukrainians had been killed or harmed in some way as a result of this war. I think he's right. Where's our humanity? We don't seem to have the slightest compassion for the Ukrainian population. It doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah. So if you make arguments like that, if you take a balanced approach, talk about facts, and state that maybe it is better to be subject to Russia and live and maybe fight another day than absolutely beat Russia today or try to beat Russia today or send Ukrainians in to beat Russia today, then you're Putin apologist, you're a Vatnik, you're all kinds of things. But so you can't even discuss these things reasonably.
Well, remember, Bernd, that at the beginning of all of this, the Russian ground force was very small, and everybody scoffed at the Russian army. They said it's too small to do anything. They don't have the capability. Well, they had enough to defend Russia, which is what Putin was interested in doing. He had no interest in conquering Eastern Europe or anything else. It's a lot of nonsense. And it became very clear after the attempt at a peace agreement that would have ended this with some sort of negotiated outcome failed, that he was going to have to stop and re-examine all the assumptions that he made before he went into Ukraine. I think he assumed that he would have a negotiating partner in Washington and in other European capitals. I think he assumed that he could master the situation with the force that he had. And he discovered that those two assumptions were wrong. So now we have the results of our labor. He's assembled and fielded the most powerful ground force in the world. Let there be no mistake about it. They are very well armed. They're well trained. They've got good leadership. All this nuts about, well, the Russians, they have terrible morale. They're not reliable. Russians are lazy. Russians are stupid. I've heard it all. It's nonsense. This is a very fine force. And the real people we should be looking at are ourselves. And the wise thing to do at this stage is to come to an agreement. And look, how many times have borders changed in European history?
Yeah.
So we change a border and we get peace. And peace is valuable. Peace is worthwhile. And the critical condition that Putin had from the beginning was that Ukraine be neutral. When I was stationed at Supreme Headquarters, Allied Powers Europe, back in between 1997 and 2000, it was widely said over and over and over again by everyone, what's Ukraine's mission in Europe? And everyone agreed it was to be a neutral buffer that put hundreds of miles between us and the future Russian military. Well, I always thought that was a rather intelligent solution. Now we've done the opposite.
Yeah. Yeah. Now their job is to beat Russia for us.
Yeah.
Yeah. What do you think of the EU? It seems to be intertwined with NATO and the US. And
I think the EU, if it were largely economic in character and focus, would be successful. But it too has caught the same ideological disease. Now we're trying to destroy the Netherlands, one of the most productive nations in the world when it comes to agriculture. Here's the tiny little Netherlands. The farmers are so brilliant and effective that they can feed half the world with their products. So obviously the solution is let's destroy the farmers in the Netherlands. I remember always admiring the German farmers and the vast lands that they had under cultivation and their produce. So obviously it's time to destroy them as well. This is all sheer lunacy. And I can't believe that no one in Europe, in any sort of common sense, with a lick of common sense, can watch any of this and make sense of it. I don't understand it. I can't explain it. All I'm telling you, though, is when the EU strayed into this sort of ideologically driven horror machine and decided that they were going to dictate to everyone in Europe a uniform set of guidelines to turn everyone into the sedated consumer who would embrace the war on climate or climate change as the organizing imperative for everything. I guess everybody just sort of took the wrong medicine and is now permanently deranged. I don't know.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's not a way to fight a war, by destroying your production and your energy supply, and uh, that doesn't work. Yeah. Okay. Um, how is our country, our choice, working out?
Well, we're up to almost 275,000 members. I think the last time we talked, we were perhaps at 100 or 150,000. And I think it's because more and more people look at us and the positions we take, and they're saying, what's the point of voting for either the Republicans or the Democrats? Because it doesn't make much difference who you vote for. You get the same bad outcome. And that's what people are now worried about as we move into the fall. How much can Donald Trump actually change? Remember, he still has to deal with this very corrupt Congress that is donor dependent. When I say donor dependent, I mean they're effectively the financially dependent slaves of big donors, whether it's a foreign lobby or a domestic lobby. So that's part of it. I think the other thing is that we've started to say we've got to recruit people who as Americans simply love their country and are committed to the best interests of the country, and we want to put them into positions of authority in Washington. I mean, the last thing that you want to do is go back to the poison well and draw more poison. Well, what's the poison well? It's all of these Ivy League universities and the service academies that are teaching all of this woke nonsense, teaching and instructing people in irrationality and preaching this internationalism that is a recipe for endless war and intervention. So we're doing very well. And it'll be interesting to see what happens this fall. I mean, I certainly hope that whoever ends up being elected can ultimately change things. And I guess that's probably going to be Donald Trump. But again, all depends on electoral integrity. And our electoral system is in bad shape. We've created all these opportunities for cheating, all this absentee ballot business, online voting. I mean, just go down the list, and it instead of simply saying on the day of you show up, you present your identity as an American citizen, and it's validated, and where you live, and you vote. And if you can't show up, that's unfortunate, but that's the way it is. And the only exceptions we ever made in the past were for people like me who were serving overseas in the military, who could not get home. We were eligible for absentee ballots, and that was it. I thought the system worked very well. Obviously, it did not, because the wrong people were not winning.
It's only democracy if the right people are winning, right?
That's right.
So the idea that you can vote without presenting an ID is it's fascinating, to say the least. Yeah.
Well, that's racist, you see. If you demand that everyone have a photo identification, at least from state government, I would like to have a national identity card as a minimum. So if someone says, this is me and this is where I live, and you can prove it with at least two forms of identity. One should be federal and one should be state. One would celebrate that, because that means that you are a privileged human being. You have American citizenship. You have the right to vote. You can exercise that franchise. That used to be a point of pride in the United States. People were very proud of that. A lot of people came to the United States from very tough circumstances and wanted desperately to be Americans. The people coming into our country today are not interested in the least in being Americans.
Yeah, Swedes. I think there was 1 million Swedes who went over. A third of our population left. Some of the best. Yeah. All right. Thank you for your insights and the wise words. We'll see if we can somehow make them reverse that DCA agreement.
Oh, I think someone has got to have the guts to stand up in your parliament and say, wait a minute, this should not be in effect until we have studied it and approved it. His signature alone is not enough. After all, he's not a head of state. He is not even the prime minister. He's just a cabinet member, the secretary for military affairs, right? The Ministry of Defense. That's not enough, I would think.
Yeah, I agree. All right. Thank you very much, and best of luck with our country, our choice. Something like that is needed. We need something similar here too. So we'll see what you do and see if we can copy.
Open up a chapter.
We should do that, actually.
All right. God bless.
You too. Thank you very much.